What happened on this flight just shouldn't have been possible. The sequence of events needed to create this nightmare was so outlandish that no one would believe it if it wasn't for the fact that it actually happened. Stay tuned. The story I'm about to explain started out as a completely normal flight with the South Korean flag carrier Korean Air. Among its many routes, Korean operates a regularly scheduled passenger service from Seoul Incheon International Airport down to Mactan Cebu International Airport on the Philippine island of Cebu. And on the 23rd of October 2022, this flight was being operated by a 24-year-old wide-body Airbus A330, which as a type is a decades-old reliable workhorse. The crew for this flight included a captain who knew the A330 better than most. At 52 years old, he had accrued around 13,000 flying hours, of which more than 9,200 had been flown on the A330, and that meant that he had spent most of his flying career on it. His first officer on this particular day was 37 years old and significantly less experienced. He had accumulated around 1,600 flying hours in total, with a little over 1,000 flown on the A330, so even though he wasn't massively experienced, he had also flown the majority of his career on this awesome old aircraft. Now, in addition to the two pilots, there were also 9 cabin crew and 162 passengers on board the flight, giving a total head count of 173. Now, before departure, the flight crew reviewed the dispatch paperwork, the technical log, as well as the weather. The forecast showed that the conditions were going to be fine for most of their route, but it looked like some cumulonimbus, thunderstorm cells, would be present over the Cebu area around the time of their scheduled arrival, which was a little after 2200 local time. With thunderstorms around, the pilots planned to perform an RNP approach into Mactan Cebu Airport since the ILS was not working, and they would have also anticipated turbulence, poor visibility, and even a possible diversion if things got really bad. It is always quite tricky to plan for arrivals around thunderstorms, as the weather can be completely fine, but also well below landing minimums, depending on where those storm cells turns up. So generally, in conditions like that, we pilots add a minimum of around 15 to 20 minutes of extra fuel to enable us to wait for a storm to pass. But in this case, the conditions weren't forecasted to be nearly bad enough to prevent the crew from actually dispatching, and the technical log also showed that there were no particular issues with the aircraft. So this meant that at approximately 18:05 Philippine time, Korean Air Flight 631 lined up on the runway at Seoul Incheon Airport and then took off normally into the evening sky, with the captain operating as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. But these pilots had no idea that deep inside their Airbus A330's hydraulic system, a fault was now lurking, one that hadn't been recorded in the tech log nor anywhere else. In fact, no one even knew that this type of fault could occur until after this flight. Anyway, this issue that will soon come to play a major role in this story had to do with the alternate brake hydraulic system. So before we go any further, we should probably have a look at what that actually is. The Airbus A330 has 2 brake control systems, normal and alternate, to maintain redundancy by also using 2 different hydraulic systems. Like all airliners, the A330 has several independent hydraulic systems in order to ensure that critical systems remain at least partially operable if one of the systems would fail. On Airbus aircraft, these systems are identified using the colors green, blue and yellow, and in the case of the normal brakes, the green system is normally used. But if that system would fail, well, then the blue system will jump in. So braking using the green system is called normal braking, and braking using the blue system is therefore referred to as alternate braking. Now, the basic structure of any hydraulic system includes several different elements whose roles we really need to understand here for this story to make any sense. Firstly, the pressure in the system comes from a pump that forces the fluid through the hydraulic lines, and the actual supply of hydraulic fluid is then maintained from a reservoir. The line that feeds hydraulic fluid from the reservoir into a valve or an actuator is called the service line, and conversely, the line that carries hydraulic fluid back to the reservoir after the actuators is called the return line. So in that way, a hydraulic system is a lot like an electrical circuit. The fluid is propelled out of the reservoir through an actuator that moves something like the brakes or the flaps, and then it returns to the reservoir via the return line. Now, there are a lot of different components that the hydraulic fluid passes through on the way towards the brakes in this case, and the one that we need to talk about here is a device called the park hydraulic manifold. This manifold is the first place that hydraulic fluid goes into as it moves from the reservoir towards the brakes, and its purpose is to divert some hydraulic fluid into the accumulators to supply pressure into the parking brake and emergency brake when there is no power in the system. This is a very important function, but when we are on the subject of diverting something, did you know that your personal data, like your phone numbers, emails and personal contacts, are likely right now being sold online to the highest bidders? This is why you're getting more and more phishing emails, spam texts and robocalls, and it turns out that this is done by perfectly legal entities known as data brokers. Now, the good news is that since it is completely legal, it can also be stopped, and that's where today's sponsor Incogni comes in. Incogni tracks down and forces all of these data brokers to immediately stop selling your data. And when I tried them out, I was honestly stunned to see that my data was being sold by more than 100 of these brokers. It would have taken me weeks to chase them down myself, if I even knew how, but with Incogni it was super easy. And the best part is that Incogni then runs in the background, guarding my data so that I can concentrate on making these kind of videos for you instead. Incogni will also stay with you and keep scrubbing the internet free of your data for as long as you stay with them. And if you want to take the step and start protecting your digital privacy, then Incogni has a super deal for you, my viewers. Just use your phone camera and scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT. That will give you 60% discount off the yearly plan, which is pretty awesome. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's get back to the video. Now, I mentioned the parking and emergency braking system before, but what I want to focus on right now is a small safety feature within the park hydraulic manifold called the pressure release valve, or PRV. The PRV is designed to prevent damage to the hydraulic system in the event of an overpressure, which could occur if there's a blockage that prevents fluid from reaching the return line, for example. So when the pressure on the service side of the PRV reaches a value that is sufficiently far above the normal system operating pressure, this valve will open, releasing hydraulic fluid directly from the park hydraulic manifold into the return line, where it then flows back into the reservoir. Now, that sounds benign enough, but what no one knew was that on this particular aircraft, this PRV had suffered damage at some point during the airplane's 24-year-old service history, unknown when and how. This damage, in combination with a loose spring, allowed the PRV to open when the service pressure was equal to the normal operating pressure, which basically meant all the time. And in this condition, the PRV leaked hydraulic fluid back into the return line at the rate of around half a liter per minute. Now, I know you might be thinking, how is it possible that a hydraulic leak like that could continue without anyone noticing? And the answer to that was that this was an internal leak, and since it was just leaking back into the return line, the hydraulic fluid never actually left the system. So the only effect this leak would have was on the rate of brake accumulator pressure loss when the aircraft was parked. You see, the brake accumulators essentially store hydraulic pressure while the hydraulic pumps are running in order to maintain pressure on the parking brake later after electrical power to the aircraft has been turned off. This pressure then naturally bleeds away over the course of a few hours, which is why when we park an aircraft overnight, we have to make sure that we put shocks around the wheels to keep the aircraft from start moving when the brakes eventually release. Now, hydraulic fluid from the brake accumulators has to pass through the park hydraulic manifold, where in this case some of it was leaking back into the reservoir via the loose PRV, causing the accumulator pressure to run down faster. But because a loss of accumulator pressure was expected and no one was monitoring how fast this was happening, there was almost no way for pilots or the engineers to notice that the pressure on this aircraft was running down faster than normal. Now, If the brake accumulator pressure would be low when the pilot started the plane back up again, standard procedure on the Airbus A330 was just to turn on the hydraulic pumps and repressurize the accumulators, which is a totally normal thing to do before the first flight of the day. And there certainly wasn't any requirement to report this low accumulator pressure in the technical log. In fact, it would probably have been quite weird to do. As a result, there was no indication available to the flight crew that would prompt maintenance to take a look at the PRV. And checking the PRV's opening pressure also wasn't part of any routine maintenance activity for the Airbus A330, so it wouldn't be checked unless someone reported a problem, which for the reasons that I just explained, nobody would. So knowing this, you can now see how a fault like this may lie dormant inside of the system for years, maybe even decades, basically just waiting for it to become relevant somehow, and it soon would. Back aboard Flight 631, everything seemed perfectly normal as the crew monitored the aircraft through the cruise phase and soon started preparing for their coming approach into Cebu. As they were getting closer, the wind initially favored runway 04, so the crew set up and briefed for the RMP approach to that runway. But as they were descending and before actually reaching the start of the approach, air traffic control informed them that the wind had now suddenly shifted to favor the reciprocal, runway 22 instead. This is pretty common when there are thunderstorms around, since they can quickly affect the strength and direction of the wind, so the pilots in this case agreed to switch to runway 22 in order to avoid having to land with a tailwind. And after quickly having rebriefed for that new approach, they started receiving radar vectors and soon intercepted the inbound course and path for runway 22 successfully. Despite the darkness and stormy weather, they were soon able to see the runway well before their decision height, and the captain therefore decided to continue the approach. But then, at a very low altitude, a heavy rain shower moved in front of them, causing the crew to completely lose sight of the runway. The captain reacted immediately by executing an go-around, and that was then flown perfectly according to the published procedures. And after having completed the relevant checklist and talked to the cabin crew and passengers, the pilots were soon vectored back towards the start of the approach in order to give it another try. This, by the way, is why it's a good idea to carry some extra fuel in these kind of stormy circumstances, as it is really nice to have the option to fly several different approaches, since storm clouds often move out of the way relatively quickly. In any case, Flight 631 soon intercepted the RMP a second time and started descending down towards runway 22. But another storm cell was now approaching the airport, meaning that once again the approach started to go wrong at a relatively low altitude. When flying an approach, we always have to maintain certain stabilization criteria in order to make sure that we're on track for a safe and controlled landing. That means that below 1,000 feet on approach, if we are inside clouds, or latest at 500 feet if we are visual, we must have the aircraft fully configured for landing, power levels correctly positioned with the correct speed and descent rate, on glide path, and with no major control inputs required in order to stay on course for the touchdown zone. Now, it can be a little bit tricky to adhere to that last point when there is gusty winds or turbulence like it was in this case, especially after turning off the autopilot, which we normally do just before we reach our minimums. If the wind pushes the plane off the glide path, we instinctively want to use our controls to regain the glide path, but when we do that, it's super easy to overcorrect, since the winds can change faster than the plane responds to our control inputs. That can in turn lead to the pilot chasing the descent path, repeatedly rising above and falling below it due to the control inputs being out of phase with the turbulence or inertia of the aircraft. Now, to avoid this, one technique is to just aim for a particular vertical speed instead, normally around 750 feet per minute. But if that's not enough, well, then it's normally better to just go around. But it can be hard to suppress the instinct to chase the path, and it's worth noting here that while this captain was very experienced, he had spent most of his career flying long haul, so he might not have had quite as much landing experience as his number of hours would suggest. Anyway, as Flight 631 came in for its second approach, the captain disengaged the autopilot as he normally did, only to find himself fighting significant turbulence at the height of only 300 feet above the ground. And for reference, that's about 25 seconds before touchdown. Feeling the gusty winds pushing them below the path, he instinctively pitched up, which caused the plane to rise back above the descent path once the gust subsided. He then reacted to that by pushing forward on his side stick to lower the nose, which caused the descent rate to increase to 1,000 feet per minute, a bit more than what we want at such a low altitude. This caused the plane to quickly go below the path, meaning that at 150 feet the captain again pitched up to correct. But at that moment, the wind suddenly shifted from a crosswind to a tailwind, accompanied by a downdraft with a velocity of about 500 feet per minute. Because of that, his pitch-up input was now insufficient to reduce the descent rate, and it became clear that the approach was no longer stabilized. The first officer, who was monitoring the instruments and noticed that they were now sinking fast, called out, "Sink rate, go around," just like he should in that situation. Outside, the poppy lights on the runway were now showing 4 glaring red lights, indicating that they were now dangerously low. A split second later, the ground proximity warning system also called out "Sink rate," just as the captain pulled his side stick back and pushed the power levers forward in order to start executing the go-around. But by the time that the first officer made that go-around call, they were less than 75 feet above the ground, and there just wasn't enough altitude left to pull it off without first touching down. Now, if the crew had initiated the go-around just 1 second earlier, none of the subsequent events would have taken place, which just shows how small the margins can be this close to touchdown. This is why it is so important to always adhere to the stabilized criteria below 500 feet. Now, I think that the pilots were doing their best here and also reacted reasonably quickly, but unfortunately in aviation, sometimes split seconds really do matter. Because as the engines were now accelerating towards go-around thrust, Flight 631 touched down with its main landing gear just a couple of meters short of the paved surface of runway 22. Now, the edge of the paved runway surface was raised above the surrounding grass due to soil erosion and lack of maintenance, and this had created a sharp step measuring about 15 centimeters of height. What this meant was that as Flight 631 now contacted the ground, its right main landing gear now slammed directly into this step, sending a massive shock shuddering through the entire aircraft. The impact pushed the right main gear shock absorber all the way up into the stop, but even that wasn't enough. The collision was so violent that it exceeded what the gear assembly had been designed to withstand, and like on most modern airliners, the A330 has articulated main gear bogies that tilt so that the aft pair of wheels touch down first, followed by the front pair, which helps to make the landing smoother. This tilting system is controlled by a hydraulic actuator that moves a pair of articulated links attached to the aft part of the bogie beam. So when the bogie impacted this step, the aft end of the bogie was forced upwards with so much force that it pulled the articulation mechanism downwards beyond its maximum range, which in turn caused the lower articulation links to break clean in half. This then allowed the forward end of the bogie to travel upward until it bounced off the surrounding structure, causing the bogie to swing back the other way as the airplane lifted into the air. The aft end with the aft wheels attached to them now swung upwards past its maximum travel range until it slammed into several crucial components, including the brake manifold and the hydraulic lines from both the blue and the green systems. This overtravel also ripped out multiple electrical harnesses that carried the wiring for all major sensors on the right gear, including those that measure wheel RPM, weight on wheels, and the actual position of the bogie. After the aircraft had bounced back into the air, the flight crew carried out the rest of the go-around procedure as they climbed towards a safe altitude. Now, they knew that they had touched down briefly, but they had no idea that the aircraft was badly damaged. And this was because, in order to prevent distractions during critical phases of flight, all except the most serious warnings are inhibited below 1500 feet. But as they climbed through 1500 feet, a whole slew of fault messages suddenly appeared on their electronic centralized aircraft monitor, ECAM, and that finally made them realize the full scope of their problems. Using the standard callouts, the captain now asked for ECAM actions, and the first officer started reading off the first ECAM item, landing gear LGCIU 1 and 2. This indicated that the two landing gear control interface units were both having problems, and they are a pair of redundant computers who aggregate data about the landing gear provides that information to other computers and transmits commands back to the landing gear control systems. The LGCIUs receive data from independent sensors and electrical harnesses on each landing gear bogie, but in this case, the severe impact to the right main gear had disconnected the electrical harnesses that were supplying sensor data to both of these LGCIUs. This meant that they could now no longer determine whether the right main gear was up or down, what position the bogie was in, whether the gear was on the ground or not, or if the wheels were even spinning. And that lack of inputs was what had triggered the LGCIU fault messages that now popped up on the ECAM. Now, because the LGCIUs were unable to determine whether the right main gear was up or down, when the first officer had moved the landing gear lever up during the go-around, the gear hadn't actually retracted and was therefore still hanging out. But the pilots had no idea about that, and although one might think that the lack of gear retraction sound would be obvious, in a situation with loads of different distractions like this, it's actually much easier to notice something that is there but shouldn't be than something that should be there that isn't. If the pilots would have looked at their fuel flow, they would have noticed that it was significantly higher than it should be, but that didn't happen. Anyway, reading off the ECAM actions for the LGCIU faults, the first officer stated, "For landing with gear extension, normal extension, try, if unsuccessful, landing gear gravity extension only." The crew then scrolled down to reveal the next ECAM warnings, this time normal brake fault and anti-skid fault. Now, if we go back to talking about normal and alternate brakes again, normal brakes uses safety features like auto brakes and anti-skid, but alternate braking is instead fully manual with fewer or even no automated protections. The anti-skid system, which is similar to the ABS system on your car, compares wheel RPM to the aircraft's ground speed in order to detect a skid, and it then releases brake pressure if a skid is sensed, allowing the wheel to stop the skid and therefore maximizing brake efficiency. But the disconnection of the LGCIU wiring harnesses had resulted in a loss of data from all 4 right main wheel tachometers, which in turn had disabled the anti-skid system since it couldn't determine whether the wheels were spinning or not. And that loss of anti-skid protection then prompted an automatic switchover from normal braking to alternate braking, without anti-skid. And that was what had now generated the normal brake fault ECAM message that I mentioned before. As this message appeared, the captain stated that he was worried about the brakes, and the first officer read off the associated ECAM actions, which warned the pilots not to apply more than 1000 psi of brake pressure with the pedals in order to prevent skidding. Now, if you think that this starts to sound bad, just wait, because this wasn't even close to the end of the side effects from this landing gear damage. Soon, another ECAM message also warned the pilots of a thrust reverser fault, which would also prevent the use of reverse thrust during the landing, and this had in turn been caused by the loss of all weight on wheel sensors for the right main gear. You see, when there is a discrepancy between the weight on wheel indications from the right and the left main gear, the flight computers must assume that the airplane is still airborne. And because of that, they must also lock out the thrust reversers to prevent a single faulty weight on wheel sensor from leading to an in-flight reverser deployment. But this also meant that since the computers would remain in flight mode even after the airplane touched down, it would also prevent the A330's ground spoilers from deploying. Much like the thrust reversers, the ground spoilers are only meant for use on the ground, so if the computers can't determine that the plane is on the ground, the spoilers can't be used. And that will obviously significantly increase the required stopping distance, since the brakes are much less effective without the spoilers bringing the weight down. Now, I'm guessing that quite a few of you are inching closer to the screen right now, since you can maybe start to see where this is going, but just wait, it gets even crazier. Flight 631 had now lost normal braking, anti-skid, auto brakes, thrust reversers and ground spoilers, leaving the manual alternate brakes as the only available braking system. So it is no wonder that the captain was worried here, even though I doubt that he understood the full width of this at this point. Anyway, in order to get more information, he now contacted the Korean Air Maintenance Control Center and listed all of the warnings that they were now receiving. And the pilots also discussed whether they had touched down inside or outside of the runway without actually coming to any definitive conclusion. And after a while, once they had gone through the relevant procedures, they then started accepting vectors from air traffic control for yet another approach. Now, the first thing that the pilots did during this third approach was to test whether the landing gear could be lowered, being still unaware that it was, in fact, already down. The first officer used the alternate landing gear extension mechanism to gravity drop the gear, which caused the left main gear and nose gear downed lock lights to illuminate, but not the right main gear light, even though that gear was in fact still down and locked. The reason for that discrepancy was simply that there was no data coming from the right main gear position sensors, and noticing the missing light, the captain asked why the gear wasn't coming down, but the first officer, he didn't know any more than the captain, so he could only affirm that one of the lights did not come on. In response to that, the captain told the first officer to request to break away from the approach and instead asked for a clearance to a holding pattern at the Almar waypoint while they tried to sort out this issue. Air traffic control responded and instructed them to climb to 4,000 feet and then proceed direct to Almar, which the crew subsequently did. As they proceeded into the hold, the captain now told Korean Air Maintenance that they had attempted a gravity extension but that the right main gear was indicating unsafe. And as he was doing that, at the same time the first officer proactively looked up the emergency procedure for landing with an abnormal gear and began reading out the steps that they needed to take. This included shutting down the engine on the side of the failed landing gear using the master switch immediately after touchdown in order to minimize the damage in the event that the engine might contact the ground following a landing gear collapse. After they had reviewed all of the steps in this procedure, the captain then called the purser to inform the cabin crew that they were about to perform an emergency landing and that he would issue a brace command 1 minute before touchdown. He then also called Korean Air Operations and informed them that they were making an emergency landing with an unsafe right main gear. And lastly, he called air traffic control, stating, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Korean 631, landing gear unsafe. We are going to make an emergency landing approach. Please prepare." Now, I want to take a few seconds here just to point out that all of the flight crew's actions here were quite professional. A good example of how to handle a situation like this. Yeah, these problems had been caused in part by the pilots' inputs, but once they were faced with these issues, they followed procedures, kept everyone informed, and didn't rush into anything. Good stuff. Anyway, for the next couple of minutes, the captain remained on the radio with operations control in order to finalize their contingency plans before making the next approach. And in this conversation, the crew and operations discussed the possibility of diverting to Davao on the southern island of Mindanao, where the weather was reported to be a little bit better. But in the end, the captain decided that they had plenty of fuel left, so they could make at least one more approach first. Now, one of the things that the pilots did not take into account when taking this decision was the fact that they were now burning fuel at a much higher rate with the landing gear extended. And also that it had never actually retracted after their last go-around, so it is likely that it wouldn't retract after a subsequent go-around either. The report doesn't say whether they had enough fuel to fly to Davao with the gear extended, but given that they had loaded quite a bit of extra fuel in Seoul due to the expected bad weather, it is possible that they could. But this decision to stay for one more approach would end up being much more important than anyone could have known, as you will soon see. Anyway, by this point the crew knew that they would be landing with several braking systems inoperative, but they still believed that they would be able to stop on Cebu's long 10,860-foot runway using the alternate or even the emergency brakes. But what they didn't know was that the hydraulic systems who normally operate those brakes were also compromised. You see, the alternate brakes utilized the blue hydraulic system, which had been breached when the articulated bogie traveled beyond its maximum rotation range. Now, modern aircraft are required to have hydraulic cutoff points or fuses that contain damage from a hydraulic leak before it can actually drain the whole system, and that was indeed the case here as well. These safety valves should activate if hydraulic fluid is leaking at a rate of at least 12 liters per minute, which hadn't happened yet because there wasn't any hydraulic fluid in the brake lines thanks to a device called the Brake Dual Distribution Valve, or BDDV. The BDDV supplies hydraulic pressure to the brake lines only when braking is being actively applied, which in this case should have prevented any leak from taking place prior to the aircraft actually touching down. Then, when the pilots put pressure on the brake pedals, what should happen is that the BDDV releases fluid into the broken lines. The leak rate rapidly then exceeded 12 liters per minute, and the safety valves would therefore cut off the flow to the right main gear. But since that leak would be contained and there would still be fluid in the system, this would assure that the brakes on the left main gear would still continue to operate. Smart, right? Yes, but it is quite hard to stop with brakes only on one side, since asymmetric max braking can result in a loss of directional control as rudder authority decreases during the rollout. So, with the usable brake pressure on the left side limited this way, and with no spoilers and no reversers, calculations later showed that the runway in Cebu was actually very slightly too short. But if that calculated scenario was what had actually happened, the airplane would have just exited the runway slightly, it would likely have been towed back from the grass onto the gate, and this video might never have been made, and this aircraft would probably still be in service right now. But instead, what made this situation go from very bad to catastrophic was that little insidious latent fault that I told you about in the beginning. Remember that leaky little pressure release valve? Now that valve had been leaking hydraulic fluid back into the return line at the rate of half a liter per minute for years. But when this hard touchdown broke some of the blue hydraulic lines on the right main gear, something had suddenly changed. You see, when the system is fully pressurized, hydraulic fluid entering the return line goes to the reservoir, because that's where everything is normally flowing. But when the return line was broken at the brake level, suddenly the entire stretch from the brakes back up to the reservoir was open to the outside, reducing its internal pressure down to ambient atmospheric pressure. That meant that when the hydraulic fluid escaped from the PRV, it was no longer drawn back up into the reservoir, but rather towards the region of low pressure. So it had now started traveling the wrong way up the return line towards the breach. Along the way, this leaking fluid passed through the BDDV, which, if you recall, was keeping the hydraulic lines on the right main gear unpressurized. But the BDDV didn't stop this leak, because it was only designed to preclude hydraulic fluid from entering the downstream regions via the service supply port. It wasn't designed to prevent fluid from flowing the wrong way up the return line, since that should just never happen. As a result, the leaking fluid was able to flow all the way down to the breach in the return line and then out of the aircraft at a steady rate of half a liter per minute. As the flight crew continued to circle at Almar in order to work through the various ECAM actions, the hydraulic pressure was therefore steadily dropping in the blue system, which supplied the alternate brakes. At time 2300, as Flight 631 was starting its fourth approach, the amount of hydraulic fluid in the blue reservoir had dropped low enough to generate yet another ECAM warning, this time for hydraulic B reservoir low level. The first officer saw this message and called out the associated ECAM action, which was to turn off the blue hydraulic pump in order to prevent more fluid from being pumped out through the breach. The captain acknowledged, and the first officer then reached up and turned off the blue system hydraulic pump. This meant that they now wouldn't be able to use the alternate brakes either, but in theory that wouldn't reduce their overall braking power due to the existence of the emergency brakes, the final redundancy in the brake system. So just to reiterate something that I said near the start of this video, the leaking PRV was located inside the park hydraulic manifold, which was designed to divert hydraulic pressure to the parking brake accumulators, who pressurizes the blue system to hold the brakes on when power to the airplane is turned off. However, in the case that the pilots have to turn off the hydraulic pumps in flight, like they did in this case, the parking brake can also act as an emergency brake, using this residual accumulator pressure, which normally allows for 1 or 2 applications of maximum braking. Now remember how one of the side effects of this PRV leak was that the accumulator pressure decreases more rapidly than normal? Yeah, that's what now happened. Without the pressure from the hydraulic pumps feeding more fluid into the park hydraulic manifold, the only pressure in the system was now coming from the accumulators. So as fluid continued to leak out of the PRV, the brake accumulators now also started quickly depressurizing. In fact, by the time Flight 631 started descending down the glide slope, most of the accumulator pressure was already gone, which meant that the A330 was now left with nearly no brakes at all. But the pilots had no idea about this. Now, I really want to emphasize here just how incredibly rare it is to see so many redundant systems fail. We had the failure of the air-ground indication system, preventing the use of the thrust reversers and spoilers. The failure of the wheel speed transducers that led to the loss of anti-skid and normal braking via the green hydraulic system. This then in turn activated the damaged blue system, and then the latent leak from the PRV caused the loss of both alternate and emergency braking as well. That is just, well, crazy. Anyway, as this approach continued, the pilots were clearly very concerned about the situation, because the captain now said, "Okay, take a look. After landing, if the situation is not going well, take everything off," by which he probably meant cut engine power and hope for the best. But even so, they had no idea just how bad things would turn out to be. And as the giant aircraft started approaching the runway, the captain also made a PA to the passengers to brace for impact. At time 23:07 and 39 seconds, Korean Air Flight 631 touched down at the correct speed and within the touchdown zone of runway 22. The pilots moved the thrust levers to idle, then back to reverse, although the thrust reversers of course did not deploy, and as expected, the spoilers also didn't extend. But the pilots slammed on the emergency brakes anyway, because it was all that they had. However, there was now so little residual pressure left in the accumulators that after just 10 seconds of braking, with the airspeed falling through 107 knots, all pressure was suddenly lost and the brake pedals went completely dead. With no braking systems remaining, the 173 passengers and crew were now left at the mercy of fate. In the cockpit, the pilots now tried everything that they could think of in order to try to get this aircraft to stop. They held the brake pedals down as far as possible with obviously no effect, and the first officer tried to execute the abnormal gear procedure by shutting off the engine on the affected side. But under the extreme stress that he was under, he instead started shutting down the opposite engine by mistake. The captain shouted out, "Do not shut it off!" 7 different times, indicating extreme agitation, as I think we can all understand. And the first officer flipped the master switch back on again, which actually in this case made no difference. With the engines already at idle, shutting them down wouldn't help stopping the plane anyway. As the end of the runway approached through the rainy darkness outside, the captain called out that their speed was not reducing. And then, with a forward speed of 83 knots, that's 152 kilometers per hour, Flight 631 ran off the end of the runway and then started careening across the overrun area towards numerous obstacles in the distance. With the passengers bracing for impact, the nose gear struck a concrete slab supporting the approach lighting system, causing it to collapse, but the plane still did not stop. Continuing forward, it then collided with the localizer antenna and its metal support structure, which was ripped out of the ground and tossed up over the top of the fuselage. And with that antenna still wrapped around it, the Airbus A330 then finally came to a stop, 235 meters beyond the end of the runway, heavily damaged but mostly in one piece. Inside of the passenger cabin, the flight attendants immediately initiated an evacuation through the L2 and R2 doors. The L1 and R1 doors at the front couldn't be used because the forward fuselage had been badly deformed in the crash, while the L3 and R3 doors were blocked by debris from the antennas, and the L4 and R4 doors were too high off the ground due to the collapse of the nose gear. And partway through the evacuation, the R2 door was also taken out after a steel bar had punctured the slide. But thankfully, there was no fire, so the passengers were eventually able to all evacuate through the only remaining door. The cabin crew did an outstanding job during this evacuation by rendering special assistance to passengers in wheelchairs and going back inside the cabin 4 times in order to check that no one was left behind. In the end, Only 2 crew members and 15 passengers received minor injuries, but all 173 people on board survived this crazy incident. The airplane, however, was completely written off. Investigators from the Philippines Civil Aviation Authority determined that the increase in vertical speed due to the captain's control inputs and the turbulent downdraft was what had caused the early touchdown. And the main gear's impact with the step at the runway edge had then caused all of the damage that led to the loss of all deceleration mechanisms, so these were both causal factors. The leaky PRV and the design of the low hydraulic quantity procedure, which led to the depressurization of the accumulators, was also listed as contributing factors. Now, a later study presented in the accident report showed that if hydraulic fluid had not leaked out via the PRV, allowing the use of alternate brakes on the left side, the speed of the aircraft as it left the runway would have been reduced from 83 knots down to 30 knots, which would have been significantly safer. As a result of this accident, Korean Air made several improvements to its training program for its pilots in order to improve raw pilot handling skills. And Airbus also began working on new maintenance procedures to catch leaky PRVs, as well as improved thrust reversal logic that would allow the use of reverse thrust should another crew find themselves in a similar situation. But what I really want to emphasize here is that the loss of every single braking system on a modern airliner is something of a black swan event. It is just incredibly improbable, and to my knowledge has never happened before Flight 631. In fact, if I had to guess, I would say that something like this might not happen again for a very, very long time. And the incredible part here is that everyone on board survived what sounds like a worst-case scenario. But was it? Actually, as my team and I were reviewing this story, we noticed that the accident could have been fatal if just one tiny decision had been made differently. And that was the decision to make one more approach before diverting to Davao. You see, Davao's runway is 1,000 feet shorter than the runway at Cebu, which would have meant an even higher speed when the aircraft departed the runway, but that's not the main thing here. The actual issue is that in the real event, around half of the deceleration that occurred prior to the overrun came from the still remaining residual accumulator pressure. But if the flight had proceeded to Davao, the PRV leak would have kept bleeding off that accumulator pressure until there was none left at all. And in that case, Flight 631 would have likely overrun the runway at Davao at a speed well over 100 knots, which could have caused the aircraft to careen outside of the airport boundary with potentially fatal results. Now, if you like this story, which I really hope you did, I hope that you have subscribed to the channel because it really helps me and the team. And you should also check out this video next, which is a really unbelievable story. And if you want to see all of my coming videos before everyone else, well then please use this QR code or the link in the description to join my Patreon crew. I would love to see you there. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.